All right. Well, happy Sabbath, everyone.
Happy Sabbath.
Welcome all to Truth on the Web Ministries and Church of God Woodstock's weekly sermon Sabbath series. It sounds like, is that on? Is there? Oh, sorry. I heard some background noise there. Welcome, everybody. Good to be here. It's great to be back. Wonderful tabernacles. It's good to see the people I didn't get a chance to see for the last couple of weeks. And so, as the slide would suggest, today's topic will be part 4. It's actually part 5 because of the Epicurean dilemma was like a assignment or a homework thing. So this is the 5th part, part 4 of the main topic of Love the Lord with all your mind, a study in logical thinking, and we're going to talk about cognitive biases. So Christians, amongst most people, have an unusual spot that we have to stand in regards to cognitive biases, because many, and we'll get into this in more detail a little later on, but many would accuse Christians of being biased to the point to where they're not open-minded at all. And there is some truth to that, but there also is falsehood in that as well. But this, I thought, even though this is a little blurry, but I ran across this on the internet. So this little quote here: those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And that's by George Bernard Shaw. So your mind is anchored. So we will, like I said, we'll get into some more specifics a little later on during the sermon today. But Christians, there are certain things that are not open for debate. Jesus Christ died, and as a result, his blood washed away our sins, and he was raised from the dead by the Father, and as a result, we live in hope of the resurrection. Those things they're not up for debate. They're not something that we should stand on and think, well, I wonder if that's really true. However, at the same time, we should understand that as we talk to those who are not yet convinced of the fact, that we should understand where they're coming from so that we can talk with them better. So I had some real good interactions during Tabernacles, talking with people who were not like-minded in many things that I talked about, but we were able to have earnest and passionate and open discussions about things that we disagreed about, and we didn't hate each other afterwards. And so it was an enjoyable time. And so I think that's the spirit here. While certainly Christians should not be open to, and I am not for a second endorsing or suggesting that Christians should be open to changing our minds on core foundational doctrines. At the same time, just because we are absolutely convinced of those things, we have to understand that we can come from that firm foundation, sometimes talking with other people in a way that might overwhelm them and might not leave a door open for them to be able to get their minds open. So we'll talk about that in some more detail as we go through. I'm going to do a quick review of terms. There's a lot of terms that we've covered through this series, but I want to cover these again. So an argument, first thing, today's society has made that word a bad word. It's not a bad word. A heated argument where there is hate or actual conflict, that's not good. But an argument is a coherent series of reasons, statements, or facts intended to support or establish a conclusion. It is good to argue with people. Propositions, so arguments consists of propositions. They are true or false statements that, when taken together, constitute an argument. There are 2 basic types of propositions: premises, which are true propositions that support the conclusion, and the conclusion is the truth that logically follows the premise or premises. So pretty straightforward. An argument is a coherent series of reasons to bring forth a point. That's why you would argue. And you would put forth propositions. And there's 2 main propositions: one that supports your conclusion, and then the conclusion itself. A few more review of terms here. We have strong or valid arguments. So here's a couple examples. Strong or valid argument would be a deductive argument where all the premises are true, thus the conclusion must be true. We did examples of these. I'm not going to get into more examples of these again. We did several examples of these in the previous parts. The second strong or valid argument would be an inductive argument in which all the premises are true and the conclusion is very likely to be true. So not everything can be conclusively 100% that is, and there's no other possibility. Most things that we deal with with on a daily basis are more inductively assumed based on evidence. It doesn't mean it's blind faith. It doesn't mean it has no basis whatsoever, but there is always open for other evidence could present itself at some future time that might disprove this. A weak argument is an argument, deductive or inductive, in which the conclusion is not certainly or highly likely to be true, but it might be true. So that's a weak argument. So you might have an argument where actually what you're saying is correct, but if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe what you're saying, then they're not going to necessarily be convinced by your argument because it's a weak argument. So a Christian would easily understand the fact that because the Bible says that Jesus was crucified and rose again on the third day, that is true. Someone who doesn't necessarily believe the Bible yet, just saying because the Bible says it doesn't necessarily convince them of that fact. That's an example of what I would consider a weak argument with the audience of someone who doesn't necessarily believe the Bible is authoritative. A couple more terms. An invalid argument is an argument in which one or more of the propositions are false. Either the premises might be false or the conclusion might be false. Again, we did examples of these. And then the last part, in part 3, we went over logical fallacies. So this is reasoning that is logically invalid or that undermines the logical validity of an argument. And in a minute, I'm going to do a couple of examples to help get our brains back in this. So we covered quite a few logical fallacies in the last part here. So here's a list of the ones that we covered in part 3. So there's many, many more, and there's different shades and variations of them. They may have different names and such. So I'm not going to get into all the details of these or review these. We did these in part 3. So again, why are we doing this? This sounds like a philosophy class. This sounds like, this is supposed to be a Bible sermon, not a philosophy class. So logical, rational thinking is to pursue truth. It puts our knowledge, decisions, and actions on a firm foundation, which is truth. Thinking logically is thinking as God thinks. God is logical. God is truth. So to think logically is to think as God thinks. We have here on the screen Romans 8, verses 28 through 29. And we know that all things work together for the good of them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be what? Conformed to the image of his Son. Jesus was very logical. It doesn't mean he didn't have emotions. We covered this in previous parts. It doesn't mean that he was always just very stoic and didn't have any expressions of emotion or other areas of human life. But nonetheless, Jesus was always 100% logical. Everything that he thought, everything that he did, everything that he said was 100% logical. He's the only one that can ever say that, for sure, that's ever walked this earth. But we should strive to bear his image, and that is one of the aspects of his image that we should strive to bear. We should be logical in our thinking, and our actions should be borne out as a result of the beliefs that we have logically arrived at. So I'm going to look at real quick some real quick examples here of invalid arguments. So the first one here is an invalid argument because it has a false premise. So here's the premises and the conclusion. So all have sinned. Only God can forgive sins for eternal life. Jesus never said he was God. Therefore, sins cannot be forgiven through Jesus. So if the premises there are all correct, then the conclusion is correct. However, the third premise is false. It is not true. So as a result, the argument and the conclusion is invalid. So take a look here, that one there. Jesus never said he was God. He indeed did say that. So a few examples where that's clear in John 1:1, John 8:58, other places in chapter 1 of John, John 10:30 through 31, John 20:28. John was one of John's focuses in his gospel and his letters was the divinity of Christ. The fact that it's not the only place. Matthew 28:9, for example. There are other places where Jesus's divinity is clear in Scripture. But John, certainly that was one of his focuses. So as a result, this is an invalid argument because it has a false premise. Okay, so the conclusion is wrong. Let's take another look at another invalid argument. And it's invalid because the conclusion is unsupported by the premises. So here, Jesus was born into the tribe of Judah. Jesus was born about 2,000 years ago. Therefore, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So all three of those statements are actually true, but the conclusion, therefore, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, is not supported by the premises. So while even the conclusion here is true, this is an invalid argument because they don't support the conclusion. So there were many cities in Judah that Jesus could have been born in. So not just Bethlehem. If Bethlehem was the only city in Judah at the period of time that he was born, then those two premises would support the conclusion, but that's not true. And additionally, there were many cities 2,000 years ago that Jesus could have been born in. So while the three are all correct, the conclusion is not supported by the premises. Thus, it's an invalid argument. So that's another example of a type of invalid argument. And we'll do one more type of invalid argument. And this one here is invalid because it uses a logical fallacy that we covered in the last part, in part 3. So here, each religion has its own way to salvation. There are many religions. Therefore, Jesus cannot be the only way to salvation. So if this is a complete argument and it is logically sound, then the conclusion is supported by those premises. However, there is a logical fallacy that is used here, and that in this case here is that there's a missing premise. It is possible Christianity is the only correct religion. I believe it is the only correct religion, but just for the sake of this argument, the first two premises are true, but the third premise is required to negate the conclusion. So all religions, or each religion, has its own way to salvation. There are many religions, both of those are true, but it doesn't mean that they're all right. And it doesn't mean that they make Christianity false. So in this case here, the fallacy that was applied is a false dilemma. They created the dilemma. Okay, many religions have a way to salvation, so Jesus can't be the only way. They created a false dilemma there. So this missing premise negates the false dilemma and then also shows that the conclusion can't be supported by the argument. So those were three examples of invalid arguments that I wanted to show based on some of the things that we have learned and covered in previous parts. There was the invalid argument that had the invalid premise, the invalid argument that had the unsupported conclusion, and then the one we just finished there is the invalid argument because it was logically fallacious. It had a fallacy hidden in it. So, and we talked about different ways that can happen. It doesn't mean because an argument is invalid always that the conclusion is wrong. Sometimes the conclusion can be right still. And it doesn't mean just because someone is making an argument that has one of these errors in it that they are doing it intentionally. And so we always have to watch for our own thinking to make sure we're not falling victim to it. And one of the main ways that people can fall victim to these false or invalid arguments is because of biases that we have within ourselves. So in other words, we want to believe certain things, we don't want to believe certain other things for whatever reasons, and we're going to get into those. So that's what this part 4 is about cognitive biases. So of course, to start off with that, we will need to talk about lawn bowling because that makes perfect sense. So lawn bowling is a game, as they say here, that demands both your presence of mind and heavy concentration to win a match. It looks easy, but it takes several years of practice for the players to become champions. So the bowls used in lawn bowling are biased. So the bowls, those are they look like balls. They're the black balls are on the bottom. So those are the things that people are throwing in the top picture. And then the white ball is a target ball. It's called a jack in lawn bowling, or bowls. It's actually another name for this sport is bowls. So that's the jack. So the object is to get your bowl closest to the jack and you win. Somewhat kind of like horseshoes, somewhat like bocce ball, except it's different. And it's been around since the 12th century, apparently. It is not an Olympic sport yet. People keep every year, they're trying to petition to get it added to the Olympics. I doubt that it ever will. But it actually is fairly popular in many countries. And including the USA. I found some little lawn bowling clubs here in McHenry County. So, I mean, it's around here too. So it is. I was just curious and looked. So, but it's, you know, it's played in many countries to certain extents. So the difference here is the bowl that you use. And so the picture on the right, the one that has the little curves, was a little snip I took from a YouTube video from a manufacturer of these balls that are used. And they were showing there's 3 different types based on the bias that the different curve you can get. So it's not like bowling where you throw it and you can get the curve in it. It is not possible to roll these balls straight. You cannot roll these balls straight. It's impossible. And they have to be rolled a specific way, otherwise they'll just wobble and fall all over. So there certainly is a skill to it, and there's different based on the way they're made. You'll see one side is flatter than the other, and then there's a weight on the other side that's round, so it's biased, so it rolls a certain way. And in fact, while these aren't used for this sport, you can engineer a ball with a proper bias in it to roll in almost any shape. And so here's some examples of other paths that a biased ball can take if it's properly biased. All of these different ones. It would be a different ball, but so you can make a ball that would roll around in a circle like that, or that would roll in a little spiral, or the spiral and then go around. All those different shapes, different paths. You could create a biased ball that would roll in that by just moving it forward. So it would be very difficult to throw, I think. It might be humanly impossible to throw it properly so it would follow that path, but in theory, so you can add bias so you can use the bias to affect the way the ball rolls. So I use that as an example here, and now we'll go into the word bias itself, and we'll take a look at the definition, and this is from the Webster's 1828. And so you'll notice the first definition is a weight on the side of a bowl, which turns it from a straight line. So back in 1828, that was like when you thought bias, that was the first definition that would come to mind, would be lawn bowling. Now, today, that's not so much. The second definition that I have up here is a leaning of the mind, an inclination, a prepossession, propensity towards an object, not leaving the mind indifferent. So you're biased or prejudiced is another word. Prejudice generally has a negative connotation, but it just means you've prejudged. You have certain ideas in your mind that affect how you receive information, how you interpret it, and what you believe. So it's a bias. We all have biases, and as I said, as a Christian, I have a bias. I believe Jesus Christ is the truth, the way, and the life, that there's not an exception to that. That is a bias that I have. So biases aren't always bad necessarily, but we certainly need to understand when we have them, because if we don't understand when we have them, first, we can't evaluate if they're correct to have or not. But second, if we're talking with someone else who doesn't have the same bias, then we need to understand we might need to temper our speech in a different way so that they aren't overwhelmed by our own bias. So, and then the word cognitive, just real quick. This one here I just got from dictionary.com. The one in Webster's was not all that different than this. So cognitive, which is a knowing or apprehending by the understanding manner or a manner of thinking. So cognitive biases, that's what we're talking about. So our thinking, so they're biases in the way we think. That's what we're gonna cover here and we're gonna discuss. So I've got about 25 cognitive biases that I'm gonna go over. I think it's gonna go pretty quick, but we're just gonna go through these. Some have examples, some not, but I think they'll be pretty easy to catch on to. So we'll just start off here. So the first one we're going to cover is the bias blind spot. So this essentially is seeing biases in others, but failing to see your own biases. And so that's kind of what I was talking about. And here the illustration, I got the log in my eye and I'm trying to get the splinter out of the other guy's eye. So I don't see my own biases. And as a result, so often biases hinder logical, correct thinking, more often than not. But as I gave the example, biases are not always wrong, but we should always know and understand that we have them when we're communicating with other people. It's important to understand that. A husband will be biased towards his wife, and a wife should be biased towards her husband in many matters, for example. That's not a bad thing. So bias blind spot, pretty straightforward. I have biases, and it's easier for me to see biases in other people than it is in myself. So that can create a bias. So then I think, well, I'm just coming forward this completely open-minded and logically, and you're not, because you got a bias, but I might have a bias too. So we always have to make sure that we look at ourselves in the mirror. Another type bias known as cognitive dissonance. In other words, there's a disagreement in what we believe. We're holding two different and opposite beliefs, or maybe even more than that. But so holding two contradictory ideas at the same time, like here, the red penguin going this way and the blue penguin bottom half going that way. They don't agree. They don't match up. They're opposite from each other. You can't. Now, I am sure that all of us have some cognitive dissonance within ourselves that we're not aware of. It's very easy to hold cognitive dissonance, especially in more complex ideas and biblical doctrines where things eschatology is a great example. There are so many different things that it would be almost impossible to truly sort through our own thoughts and what we believe about different aspects of eschatology and have ferreted out all of the disagreements where it's like, okay, you believe this one thing, but you believe this also. They can't both be true. So, an incongruency, yes. And also, please, if anybody has any examples they want to, or scriptures that come to mind, please interact. Don't be shy, but online as well. So I'll try to watch the chat if something comes up. The next one we're going to cover here is the congruence bias. So this is similar, but not exactly the same. So this one here is designing an experiment to confirm your hypothesis or your belief instead of an experiment that challenges it. So in the biblical realm, we decide on a doctrine and then we try to go find scriptures that support our doctrine rather than, right. So shoot the arrow, paint the target as is shown on here. So, and although this is apparently some religious monks that are doing this, I mean, it's not uniquely a thing for religious people that have these. I mean, it's definitely not. So congruence bias. Another one here, creeping normality. So this one here is a significant problem that doesn't cause alarm because it happens slowly, like the frog in a slowly boiling pot, So that can be another bias. So we can begin to accept things a little at a time because it's not all of a sudden a big thing. And then before you know it, we're at the big thing that we never would have accepted at the beginning of the process, but because it has increased, our mind has been biased a little at a time to accept certain things that would have been previously unacceptable. Right. Our culture. Right. Yes. Right. With yes. So as Brian mentions, our culture over the last 20 years with homosexuality. So it started out, as a thing that's like, well, no, that most people would have never even considered it to be a possibility that the Supreme Court would essentially endorse homosexual marriage. But a little at a time, things changed. So creeping normality. And these are called by different names also. So that's not necessarily. So the next thing we're going to talk about here is the expectation bias. So that's allowing expectations to unconsciously influence perception or methods. So we have expectations about the way things are going to be. I hope that everyone had a wonderful tabernacles. I think many of us, at least in our group, had a different tabernacles than we're used to. I mean, so I would imagine I prayerfully tried very hard to not have any expectations as to what was going to happen when I went. I'm sure I still had some, but I think for the most part, God was gracious to me and faithful to me, and he helped me set those aside so that I could be more open-minded to receive what was there to receive. So here's the example from The Simpsons. So this thing can fry a water buffalo in 40 seconds. I can't even imagine how big a fryer that must be. But and Homer's like, 40 seconds, I want mine now. So expectations, again, a ridiculous example, but nonetheless, expectations. If we have unrealistic expectations, then we can be biased when things don't live up to our expectations. And remember also, sometimes these things can be good. So we might, for example, if I was invited to a Bible study, a Wednesday night Bible study with other people that said they're Christians, I would expect that the conduct of the people there and the topics that were discussed would stay in the realm of holiness and biblical topics. If I went there and they were watching some R-rated movie with a bunch of naked people running around, my expectations would not have been lived up to, but my expectations would have been correct. So remember that these biases aren't always necessarily wrong. We always have to be aware, though, of them when we have them, because if we're not paying attention to the way we think, we can end up into rabbit trails. We don't even know how we got there.
People think that like that Christianity is going to give them the easy button.
Right.
So like that's expectation, and when they realize they got even more trials, they turn to Christianity because that's not what they expect.
Right. Brian gave the example there of people think as they're introduced or lured into Christianity as a result of, hey, it's the easy button. Your life, if your life's really bad, just become a Christian and everything's great. And then if they truly do turn their heart over and become Christians, it's going to get harder. And so then they jump back. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't what I expected. They didn't count the cost. I don't know if you noticed it, but on our little muddy drive, just a couple doors down from ours, there was a partial foundation. So I don't know if the foundation was only partially built and then they stopped, or it burnt down and it was collapsed, but nonetheless, it always brought to my mind, they didn't count the costs. They expected, oh yeah, we're going to have a great house here. And then they started working and it's like, whoa, this costs too much. It's too much work, whatever it might've been. Expectations. So we all have expectations. It's not necessarily bad. We just have to be aware that we are biased based on those. Another bias that we want to talk about here is the group attribution error. So in other words, viewing groups of people as more uniform than they are in reality. So an example here, falsely assuming that people from a particular denomination or religion all think alike. And then the little picture there's a little sun god. So just assuming because they're Roman Catholic or they're Protestant that they're sun worshipers. That's not true. Not all of them are sun worshipers. It just isn't true. Not defending Roman Catholic doctrine or many of the Protestant denominations out there, many of the doctrines they put forth, but it's just not true. So assuming just blanket up, they're sun worshipers. That is an example of group attribution error. It is a bias. Here's another one that is the graphic that I have is one that's often used against Christianity, but it's a good example of the next one here is the hasty generalization. And it's a generalization based on insufficient evidence. So this little example here is, the elephant. It's supposed to be the idea is a blind, 5 blind men or 4 blind men, I guess in this case here, are feeling it. And it's like, oh, it's a rope, it's a palm leaf, it's a snake, it's a tree trunk. They don't have complete. So they've made hasty generalizations of their experience with the elephant. So, oh, is it from a book? Is it? Yeah, I don't know. I must in totality credit the internet for all of these images. So I didn't. It would be great if we had somebody that could do illustrations and everything and stuff and all that for these, but we don't. Yes, so hasty generalization. We always have to be careful. Now, sometimes hasty generalizations serve the purpose to get beyond a certain point and move on. So that's okay. Just remember that these things aren't always necessarily bad. We just always need to be aware when they are operative in our thinking. Correct. The hasty generalization would be to say that they are always bad. Yes. The ostrich effect, ignoring an obvious fact because it is unpleasant. So here's an example here. Many people, even some that claim to be Christians, don't like to think of their unsaved family members as sinners headed for destruction. No, I mean, I've talked with many people who say they're Christians who don't even like to speak of themselves as former sinners because nobody likes that taste in their mouth, that idea that, well, I was reprobate. I was abominable. I was as bad as I possibly could have been. I just didn't have opportunity to get worse. So this is an example of, because it's unpleasant, because it's something I don't want to talk about. People who have illnesses often can fall victim to this bias here. They don't want to think about, as bad as it might get. And so nobody wants to dwell on pain and suffering, and that's understandable. But if it biases our actions and our beliefs to the point to prevent us from taking actions that could help us, then it's not a good thing, certainly. And as a side note here, according to the internet, at least, and I've heard this before, ostriches do not stick their head in the sand. They don't do that. Where that idea came from, I don't really know. Apparently, that when they're scared or frightened, they'll run away, and if they can't run, they'll flop to the ground and remain still, playing dead. Now, I've never tested it out. Next time I see an ostrich, I'm gonna go up and go boo and see what it does. But but nonetheless, the name fits. We understand that. So the ostrich effect, essentially ignoring an obvious fact because it's unpleasant. So another example of a cognitive bias is known as the outcome bias. So this is judging a past decision by its outcome as opposed to the quality or soundness of the decision itself. So the little graphic there is a guy that, hey, he got the job, but he lied on the interview. That's what it's supposed to. So, hey, so also people might think about this, the end justifies the means, kind of that idea. Although generally the end justifies the means is I'm going to justify what I'm going to do now that I know is wrong so I can get where I want to be. This is more kind of the other way. It's like, hey, well, okay, I got the job though. So I probably shouldn't lie, but no big deal. Other examples of this might be, running. No. I want some examples. Come on in. Come on. Oh. The Geico commercial. I don't know which one. So, with the Pinocchio. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, another example might be, and I used to be this way too. My driving was, I got away with a lot of bad driving, and I got away with it. And so partially in my mind, it's like, well, I can get away with it. Speeding, driving poor. I found myself a couple times coming back from Tabernacles here when I got into the construction and everything and stuff here in the Chicago area. And I was still kind of driving like I was on the nice open interstate. And I was like, whoa, what am I doing? I'm crazy. I'm nuts, but I got away with it. So oftentimes as we can get confidence, in things because we made bad decisions, but it's like, hey, I didn't get burned by them. So can anybody think of a biblical example of this? Like a biblical principle or of this same idea, this outcome bias? What came to my mind was Peter. He's like, hey, since the fathers went to sleep, where's his coming? He hasn't come yet. You keep talking about God's going to come and he's going to judge me. And I've been doing great. My life's going good. I'm having a great time. Outcome bias. I think because it seems like things are going well now, that the bad decisions that I made in the past, I got away with. And so there's no worry of making those same bad decisions in the future because I'll get away with it. Right. David says, why did the wicked prosper? Yes. I was thinking about that. The nation of Israel was given some real specific rules. If you guys don't obey, you are going to get cursed. You're going to get kicked out. Whereas most of the rest of the nations are like, well, the wicked are going to prosper. He's going to send rain. They'll pay their price at the end. Certainly, they will not receive eternal life. But for most of the world, God winked at their sin. The next one here, projection bias. So it's projecting your thoughts and emotions onto others. And the example here is assuming that other people are happy when you're in a good mood. So we probably know that, it's like you walk in a room and you're like all happy, and hey, and everybody else or somebody else is like, they're not happy. So it's like, so you have a tendency to project what your experience is on others. And so the example that I have here is Charlie with Lucy. So he knows she's going to pull the ball away, but he doesn't want. So he's hopefully projecting, okay, she won't, because he's hopefully projecting that onto her. Okay, she's not going to pull it away this time. So, and I read, so I read, so apparently this started in 1952 when the first time he did this. And so apparently Charlie never successfully kicked the football with Lucy holding it. There were a couple other times where other people held it and he was able to kick it. And apparently there was one time where Lucy held the ball and she wasn't going to let it go, but Charlie messed up and kicked her hand instead of the ball. So it didn't. So at least according to what I read, he never successfully was able to, she never held it and he was able to kick it. So projection bias. Yes. So remember, again, these can have they can be negative, they can be positive. But in all cases, we need to pay attention and be aware that we have these biases. So going back to the example that I used a couple slides ago, going to a Bible study, as a Christian, we are supposed to assume the best in people. But apart from other evidence, we're supposed to assume, we're supposed to project that on them. We're supposed to do that. That's what Scripture says. So that's not a bad thing. So we just have to be aware that we have these biases. And certainly if they negatively affect our thinking, our actions, then we need to get rid of them. Prayerfully seek out why we hold that and what it is. So another bias here, rosy retrospection. So it's recalling past experiences as more pleasant than they actually were. So the little graphic here is the road here is obviously all desolate and devoid of vegetation and just like a desert, but in the rearview mirror, it's like all nice and trees and sunrise and happiness. So that idea of looking back on the past is like, oh, it was so great. Always thinking, oh, the last generation was so good, or this generation's such a mess. There's another bias that's similar to this. I don't have it in the examples here, but declinism or decliningism, where I always think it's like, well, things are always going to get worse. They're never going to get better. And so biblically, we know ultimately things are going to get real bad before they get much better. So we know that. So that is a bias that Christians hold. But at the same time, it doesn't mean in specific things that's always true. It's like, oh, this marriage is just going to get worse, or this job is just going to get worse, or this, whatever it is that's not true. And so we always tend to, if we hold this bias, we always tend to look back at the past and like, oh, that was so great. Oh, if only it was like it was in the past, whether our lifetime or times before. Right, exactly. Yes. Brian mentions, they hated the bondage in Egypt. They hated it. But then when they're in the wilderness, they're complaining, well, why'd you pull us out of Egypt? It was great back there. We had the leeks and the pots and the rivers and everything was good. So another bias, sour grapes. So this is a tendency to criticize something you want but can't obtain. So it's like, well, I didn't want that stupid job anyway, or, well, I didn't like that girl anyway, or whatever it might be. So it's a tendency to criticize in your own mind what it is. I wanted this, but I didn't get it, so it's stupid. We have to remember this bias. So that can bias us towards things, because then we can think, well, that whatever thing we decided we have sour grapes against, then we have a bad attitude towards it. So that's an improper bias. Apparently, this is based on a folk tale about a fox who can't reach grapes, so he assumes they must be sour. I don't know for sure if that's true, but it's a good example nonetheless. It's like, I can't get the grapes, so I don't want the stupid things anyway. They're probably sour. So another one, hindsight-based bias. So here is the common tendency for people to perceive past events, and this is related to the one we just covered here, having been more predictable than they actually were. So this isn't necessarily looking back on them as they were better, but just more predictable. So it's also known as the knew it all along phenomenon. So just think about here, it's like, oh, well, I knew that was going to happen. I knew that when I might have suspected that. I do it too. I'm like, things I might have had thoughts in mind, and then it happens that way. Did I really think it was going to happen that way? Or is that just, maybe I suspected? Probably in most cases not. Otherwise I probably would have said something. So does it mean that not always do some things unfold the way we expect? It's like, oh, don't do that. The cat's going to push the thing off the table. Don't do it. Don't let the cat, there it goes. The glass is on the floor. Sometimes it does. So, but this is another bias. We have to be aware of this. Got the 2020 hindsight glasses there. So another one, and this one's interesting. This one's called anchoring. So it's not like the opening slide where we're closed-minded, even though it had an anchor as the head, but this one here is anchoring. And it's relying too heavily on the first information you receive. So think about that. And actually, so for example, the car dealerships tend to put the most expensive cars up front, thus setting the price anchor high. So first, they're the ones that are like, "Ooh, look at those really cool cars," and then you walk in and you see, "Well, that's $80,000. I ain't spending that much." So then, when they pull you back to the car that's 40,000, when you only wanted to spend 20,000, you still think, "Well, that's half of what that was." So your mind already is anchored with the 80,000, so they can use that to manipulate. So this is anchoring. So the first thing. The first piece of evidence that is presented, and so that's why in court cases, for example, this is a tool they use to great effect to anchor people's thoughts and minds on the first piece of information so that they can then disregard other information. So Proverbs 18:17 has somewhat the counter to that. So it says here, he that is first in his own cause seems just. So the first person that presents their case, your mind is anchored to their case, what they said. But Proverbs takes the next step, and it says, but his neighbor comes and searches him. So in other words, the neighbor comes and presents another point of view, presents more evidence to help break the anchor free. So that's the trick to this, or the cure for this anchor is like, well, I'm not spending 80,000, and I didn't come here to spend 40,000 either. I came here to spend this, for example. So anchoring, so that also can bias our minds. And these things can be used, like I said, by people intentionally to change the way we think, or they can be used unintentionally by ourselves or by others that do affect the way we think. So I'll use an example here from the movie we went to see last week. So I don't want to sour people on the movie. This is just one thing, but so the movie that we went to see was on the Exodus, was part 5, and what was the name of it exactly, Brian? Patterns of Evidence: The Journey to Mount Sinai. So apparently there's so the main premise of the movie is that the typical or traditional Mount Sinai isn't really Mount Sinai of the Bible. So there's 6 different mountains that they think are either ones that people would commonly think are Sinai or are likely candidates for being Sinai. And so he picks these 6, and he has like a set of tests that he applies to each one based on what scripture is and archaeological evidence and everything and such. And so this movie went through the first 3. The next movie will go through the last 3. And it's fairly apparent that the one that he believes will be the 6th one, the last one. So he believes that the last one that he's going to cover is the one that he thinks is the biblical Mount Sinai. So he goes through each of the first 3, and he has self and others present evidence for or against that particular mountain. And so during one of the presentations, one of the experts he injected a piece of information that had absolutely nothing to do with Mount Sinai or anything, but it was designed to give the impression in the mind of the people who were watching the movie that this guy was a biblical idiot. Really is what it was, because he didn't say that, but that's essentially what the purpose of, I don't know if he intended to do it that way or not, but that was the only purpose that it served. So so that's kind of poisoning the well is that's the fallacy. So the well was poisoned. So then people would automatically, anything else that came out of this guy's mouth, or they would just dismiss without even really evaluating the validity of what he said. So that's not a good logical. So that is a biased approach to listening to a logical argument. Just because the guy might actually in this one area be a biblical idiot doesn't mean that all the other arguments on the other topic that he was talking about, which was unrelated, may not have validity. So that's a bias, as an example. And it's somewhat related to anchoring, but that's how they can happen. So another example of a cognitive bias is called the sunk cost. So in other words, this is clinging to things that have already cost you something. So we have a tendency to do that. Once we're invested in something, we don't necessarily want to give it up. You know, if it's something financial that we're invested in, if we give it up, well, we've lost whatever our financial investment was. But it may be something we're emotionally invested in that we don't want to give up. It may be something that we're, at work, we're invested in some project, and our pride or our ego is invested in it and we don't want to give it up. Or it may be something that, we've just worked on for 2 years and it's like, it's finally to the point. It's like, this ain't really doing what we thought it would do. We're going to scrap this project and go on to something else. So the sunk cost. And so the example here is when you've invested time, money, or emotion into something, it hurts to let it go. And then the little image there is the roulette wheel. So it's that idea that's like, man, I've been playing this and I've been playing this and I've been playing this, and I've lost $500, but I know I'm just one spin away from getting my money back. That's a logical fallacy. It's the gambler's fallacy, actually. But I am invested in it now. And it's like, man, I don't want to just walk away losing $500. If I put another $20 down on red, maybe I can win some money back, and then I can start the roll back. But so casinos count on that. The fact the odds are always in the house's favor. They are never in your favor. Another bias that we're going to talk about here is the availability heuristic. It sounds fancy, but what it means here, I looked for another better name for that. I didn't find one, so that's what they call it. But judging things based on what's available in your memory or what first pops to mind. And so the example here, people tend to overestimate the likelihood of newsworthy events, such as an aircraft safety incident, because such events are easy to recall in memory. So how many tens of thousands of airplanes fly every single day? They hardly ever crash. But I will guarantee you, everybody's ever getting an airplane, what crosses your mind? It's going to crash. It might. I don't mean some great fear of like, I'm terrified it's going to, but that's what we think, because our mind has that availability heuristic. The little image there is like a guy watching Shark Week or whatever, watching Jaws, and then assumes, that, oh, wow, man, there's sharks in all the waters everywhere you go swimming, especially down by Galveston. There's sharks in the water. Especially by Galveston, there's sharks in the water. So it's that idea, the availability heuristic. The shark thing, when I watched Jaws, I lived in Florida. I used to go swimming. I never went in the Gulf of Mexico again. Now, we're going to live there about another year and a half or so before we moved from Florida, but nonetheless, I never went in the Gulf of Mexico again after I saw that movie Jaws. But I never knew anybody that got bit by a shark or attacked by a shark either. But that movie was terrifying. So... All right. The next one we're going to cover here is the curse of knowledge. So it's here. Once you understand something, you presume it to be obvious to everyone. So I always have to remember this. So the little Dilbert cartoon that I have up there. Someone told me your presentation was confusing and unpersuasive. Sometimes one person's inability to understand looks like another person's inability to explain. I don't understand what you just said. See? So in other words, he's putting it back on him. He's saying, no, it wasn't my presentation. It's that you're an idiot that you couldn't understand it. My presentation was good. So this curse of knowledge, that once you understand something, you presume it to be obvious to everyone. And so you might either just gloss over it and assume they already know the facts or believe the same that you do. Or unfortunately, oftentimes this can lead to a form of arrogance or even frustration with people that are like, well, don't you understand this? I told you this last week. Don't you understand it? Don't you get it? So this is a bias that actually can have a deep-seated interaction in our personal relationships. So we need to be aware of these things. Another bias that we're going to talk about, the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is the more you know, the less confident you're likely to be. So it seems like it's the opposite of the one I just covered, but it's not really. So here's the tendency for beginners and unskilled individuals to overrate themselves, and experts and highly capable individuals to underrate themselves. So let's take an example here. So the little graphic there is like a flat earther that in this here is like doesn't really know and knows a couple things, and so they think they know everything about the earth. And then there's the globe earth person who's trying to explain, but they won't just state the facts because they think, well, I don't want to sound arrogant and like a know-it-all. So they'll hem and haw, and so then there'll be no agreement come to whatever. But what can happen, this can happen in the biblical realm as well. It sounds very humble. So you might talk with someone at work about abortion, and they might they might say, well, I know, it's not alive until it's actually born, because they read that somewhere. They saw a meme on the internet or whatever, but they're very confident. They're very solid in that belief. And whereas someone who's done some research knows much more detail, but that person will almost be overwhelmed by the confidence of the one that's in ignorance and won't speak up and say, well, actually, no, there is complete scientific evidence to show that life begins at conception. And I can give you examples and show you this, so that those who actually know things tend to at times be more timid in their knowledge than those who, and then we probably all have experienced that personally. When we first come into some new knowledge, we just know we're like off like a shot. I mean, it's like, I'm gonna go tell people about this and this and this. And then we kind of, after time, and we beat ourselves up enough, and unfortunately other people, we kind of step back and realize, well, no, I was maybe a little off base in my zeal there. But what can then happen is then, as a result, we retreat too far. And so we won't be the trump with a clear sound. So because we know more, we realize there's more that we don't know. And so we develop this, what I would call false humility, that we should not have. This was named after apparently a couple of psychologists that published some paper in the 90s. But it was spoke of. I mean, the concept has been around. Bertrand Russell actually has a quote here. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are so certain of themselves, yet wiser people so full of doubts. So that idea there is. Another one that we're going to talk about here, fundamental attribution error. So this is judging others on their actions' character, but yourself on the situation. So, for example, if you haven't had a good night's sleep, you know why you're being a bit slow, a bit groggy. But if you see someone else being slow, you might presume they're just slow. So the little graphic example there is the guy running in late to the meeting. It's like, because obviously there was traffic was the problem, but the guy that's there is assuming, oh, he overslept. So that's the attribution. So you attribute their error, they're being late in this case here in this example, to some. So we're more willing to excuse ourselves and find excuse or reason, justification for our errors, like being late, and we don't give others the same. Here's another one. Reactance. So this is the urge to do the opposite of what someone is trying to make you do, regardless of what it is. So this here little sign, no target shooting, is all shot up by. So as an example. So this is one I think probably most of us suffer from one extent or another. It's like, well, if you tell me to do something, I'm going to end up being biased. Well, no, you can't tell me to do nothing, even if it's good for me, even if it's right. Don't look down. Yes. Don't look below this spot or whatever it is, don't. Yes. Reverse psychology can use that effect sometime. Yes, you might. Yeah, exactly. You made of any tree of the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Satan knew that they would react. Another bias is the backfire effect. So this is a tendency to harden a belief or opinion after being challenged. This is also known as attitude polarization. So so what happens here is you're having an argument with someone, discussing a topic with someone, and you present some fact that challenges their belief, and you think, well, this might help them, open up a little bit so we can have further discussion. But what can happen is actually will cause them to even dig in firmer into their stance. Like, well, no, I don't want to talk. All right, that's it. I don't want to talk about it, kind of. So it's the backfire effect. I intended this challenge to your belief to be a road that we could have further discussion, but it backfired. So we all have to watch that in ourselves. When someone all of a sudden challenges our stuff, we'll cover a bias in a minute on that. But another bias is the Barnum effect. So this is viewing general information as an accurate and insightful depiction of your personality. So, for example, the ability of fortune tellers and personality tests, horoscopes, whatever, to impress with statements such as, you value friendship, but also find your friends challenging from time to time. Well, who is that not true about? I mean, maybe there may be a very few people, but that could apply to anybody. But those are the kind of things that all those horoscopes are filled with, that all of it's a bunch of, so Barnum, it's called Barnum effect because a sucker's born every minute. I mean, that's the idea. It's like, you're going to fall for this. It's like, I can tell you all these vague things and you're going to be impressed and think somehow, wow, that is me. I do this and I do that. And so, right. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Here's the dog you are, or whatever it is, or here's the, yes. Those can be, I mean, so in that case there, other than the fact that I think they're trying to get information about you out of you, I would recommend not doing those, but some of those can just be fun stuff. So horoscopes and fortune telling, stay away from those. Those are wrong and those are evil. So, but I remember someone showed me, because I used to I wasn't really into those or whatever, but I mean, I was born in May, so I'm a Taurus under that sign. And I remember the description that I would see, and I was like, wow, that really is me. So somebody showed me one. They took all the descriptions of all 12 zodiac and they just mixed them all up and they randomly picked ones out and said, here you go. And I'm like, well, that's me. And it was like 2 from Virgo and 1 from Sagittarius and 1 from Cancer and 1 from, it's like, they all fit. It's not, it's all a bunch of, it's a bunch of hocus pocus. It's not. A sucker's born every minute. And this idea, although that the Barnum effect is really more personal than how it applies to my personality, it essentially allows, it can be extended further into the realm of, say, for example, biblical exegesis. So when you're trying to understand doctrines, if you got to be careful not to allow generic statements to fill in specific blanks, which is what this does. So, because the sucker's born every minute. Another example, cherry picking. It's also known as confirmation bias. It's favoring things that can confirm your existing beliefs. We're going to cover another one that's similar here. And a couple of these last 3 here are pretty similar. But so favoring things that confirm your existing beliefs. So the cartoon up there is, let's begin the meeting, but be aware that I'm documenting all of your bullying behavior. I'm not even close to being a bully. But now your confirmation bias, but now your confirmation bias will make everything I say sound like bullying to you. Can you repeat that part after you imply that I'm a delusional witch? So again, her bias is that whatever he says is going to be filtered that way. So she's cherry picking these things. So known as confirmation bias. So we always have to be careful of that we cherry pick things that fit what we believe. I think that's the last one. Right. Yes. Right. Brian says that could be related to the shoot the arrow, paint the target, which I forget what the name of it is now. So that I'll look it up in a second here. So the congruence bias. Yes. So a lot of these are overlapped, they're related, and many of these can be both logical fallacies and cognitive biases, just depending how they're used. So, but ultimately, all of these affect how we think. So we should be aware of them where they exist in us. And if they are improper biases, then we should expunge them from our thinking, certainly. But even in cases where they are proper biases, we should be fully aware that we hold them so that we can be a mensch when we talk to other people. Another one kind of related to this here, cognitive inertia. This is a general tendency for beliefs to endure even in the face of mounting evidence that suggests they are wrong. Certainly this, we can see application of this in our personal lives and in biblical. The little brick there says single supporting fact. So overwhelming proof against what I believe. I have just one little supporting fact, Matthew 12:40, for example. Sorry. So I've got all the evidence I need. So that's an example. That's just an example. So cognitive inertia. And then the last bias that we will talk about here, then we'll wrap it up with a little scripture, is the belief bias. And so this, if a conclusion supports your existing beliefs, you'll rationalize anything that supports it. So the example here is the guy that goes on Googie. so in their minds, like, oh, I heard all the rhetoric, I heard all the sides. Now I'm going to do some research and find out what's really true. And do a search, and the first thing that agrees with what I want, that's it. Look at that. See, I was right all along. You know, jackpot. It was at the top of my search, yes. So this can be so deeply ingrained in so many things that we do, especially in the biblical arena. We get frustrated because people won't listen to what we say. They won't change their minds in areas where we think they're wrong, and we have trouble. It's like, well, then I can't find a scripture that flat out tells them this, and they seem entrenched. Then we want to support, and as opposed to being open-minded and truly looking at our biases and seeing, well, maybe I'm wrong in this. Again, there are some things that are not up for discussion or debate whatsoever. The core foundational doctrines of Christianity should never be challenged in the sense of, well, maybe that's wrong, but we should always challenge those core beliefs as, how can I unbiasedly present this to someone else, setting aside my biases. So those are the biases we're going to cover. As I said, there's many more, and there's overlap where there's similarities between them. And the reason that there's overlap is because the way we think is very nuanced. It is. If we take time to stop and pay attention to the way we think, that might be scary for some people. I know it is for me at times, certainly. Then we can realize that we have thoughts and ideas that float through our head and that we accept as true, that we really have no reason that we should have accepted them, even if they are true. It's like, well, why did I believe that? And so if someone challenges it, and when I say challenge, I mean someone earnestly comes up to us and asks us a question about, hey, what about this? What about that? It's like, if someone asks, well, why were you off work this last 2 weeks? Up Leviticus 23, buddy, just read it. You know, that is a response, but I would say that's probably not a very good response. All right, so let's do a few scriptures here. So as we read in Jeremiah here, 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? What's the answer to that question? Who can know it? The Lord knows our heart. That's right. Yes, he knows it. So we need to pay attention. Our heart is desperately wicked. We need to pay attention. In John 3:19, we read here, and this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. We want to be biased in ways that affirm us, who we are, what we think is right. That's our natural inclination. However, there is good news. Romans 8, verses 9 through 11. But ye are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. If so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now, if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. And if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the Spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by his Spirit that dwelleth in you. So we don't have to fall victim to the deceitful heart. We do not have to fall victim to the heart that loves darkness rather than light, because we have Christ's Spirit and he is conforming us to his image. And as a result of that, we can be free of these biases. We can be free of the effect that they have on our own thinking, and we can be free of the effect that they have on others as we interact with them. And where biases are properly held, as in the foundational doctrines of Christianity, we can understand that we have them And that will allow us to respond in kind and properly when we are asked, what's about the hope that's in you, buddy? Or buddy yet? He that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by his Spirit that dwells in you. So take time to prayerfully think through what you believe, study the facts so you don't fall victim to arguments that have false premises in them. Constantly evaluate our own beliefs based on biblical facts and attitudes. And when talking with others, be sure to use sound logic for their benefit and for yours as well. And in closing, Romans 12, 1-2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by his Spirit. So his mind was pure and clear. It had perfect knowledge. It had perfect logic. And it had perfect love. And we should always strive towards those things as well. And where we fall short, where we trip up, is when our thoughts are either wrong in fact, which Scripture will correct for us, or in application, either we have fallacies that we are using that arrive to incorrect or weak conclusions, or we have biases that cause ourselves and others to trip over the plain, simple facts and truths of Scripture. First and foremost being that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. And that ye prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So he's given us a sound mind. Let's use it. Let's press into what he has given us. It will take discipline, just like it takes discipline to get the body working properly. It takes discipline to get the mind, where he's given us everything we need. Let's take advantage of what he has given us, because he's commanded us to be conformed to his image. So next part, I think will be the last part in this series, but we'll see. So it's going to mainly focus on a real life example that we can apply many of these principles that we've discussed over these previous parts, a discussion on postmodernism. And what that is and how it greatly affects the thought of today's world, how the Christians are often caught up in it without even knowing it, and how we can counter it both in our own minds and hearts and in the minds and hearts of the culture for those that have an open heart. So brothers and sisters, Godspeed. Have a great rest of the day, and we will see you next week.